Hi, I'm JM and this is the Lotus Diaries. Today we're asking a hypothetical question. Let's pretend you've watched all my videos, you've read all the reviews, and you've decided that the Evora 400 is the car for you. You're gonna buy one. Now let's imagine you're browsing through the classifieds, you're trying to find your perfect Evora, and then suddenly you see something. It's an amazing car, it's a beautiful Italian classic that you'd never considered, but you've maybe had a poster of on your bedroom wall as a young man, and you think, I could get one of those. And today's question is, if you could have one of those instead of one of these, should you? What's the car we're talking about? It's a car that Jeremy Clarkson once called the greatest car in the world ever. And as we know, Jeremy Clarkson never exaggerates. We're talking about the Ferrari 355. Now you might be thinking, hang on a minute, that's an unfair comparison. That Ferrari's 20 years old, that Lotus is about a week old. And you're right, it is an unfair comparison. But when you're a petrol head, you don't really make fair comparisons, you have fun. If you're just interested in playing top trumps, I can tell you which one is the fastest right away. It's the Lotus. It beats the Ferrari on paper in basically every way. But all this stuff, anyone with an internet connection can tell you. What's harder to tell is what they're actually like to drive. And that's what you're really interested in. And that's what we're going to find out now. So getting in the car, immediately you can feel the age of it really. It is what you would definitely describe as a classic Italian driving position. My knees are going to be fairly stretched out. My arms are pretty bent. This is as far back as I want to go in this seat without being able to have difficulty reaching the pedals. One thing that'll shock anyone that's been in a modern Ferrari will be the fact that the car doesn't bark and wake up the entire neighbourhood when you start it. In fact, even after the Lotus, it's pretty quiet. So let's take it out on the road and see how she does. Despite the fact that this car is only 2 inches lower than the Evora, you do feel like you sit considerably lower in it. I imagine that you probably are sat considerably lower in it. One thing definitely worth noting is we have the roof off today because my cameraman for the day, Laurie, is intent on making it rain, but even with the roof on, it's a very light and airy place. The 355 was really built as a riposte to the Honda NSX. The 348 wasn't particularly well received when it came out. And when Honda brought the NSX out, it really showed the world that you could have an exotic looking, handling, and for the time moderately powerful car that was also entirely usable and frankly like a Honda. So Ferrari really had to up their game, and the 355 is the first attempt by them to make a car that you could, should you want to, use every single day. Now this particular car has not been used every single day. It's only got about 16,000 miles on the clock, which is very low, and it's only had 3 owners. Now, one rumour I can dispel is that these are unreliable cars. In fact, like the Lotus, Ferrari seem to have something of a reputation that they don't deserve. I once spoke to a guy who said he would never want to drive a Ferrari because the exhaust gaskets are made from paper. Well, when it makes such a nice noise, they can make the exhaust gaskets from gummy bears. For all I care, it sounds wonderful. And you know what? This car's 21 years old. Have the exhaust gaskets ever failed? No, they haven't. It's a really easy car to drive. This is the first, it's either Ferrari or first mid-engine Ferrari with power steering. It's very light steering. It's a very delicate car, but it's very easy. It's very communicative. The steering wheel is deliciously old school. There's nothing on it bar a very cute horn. And you've got all the instrumentation that you could want presented in pretty simple, easy to read dials. You've got speedo, you've got your oil pressure, water temperature, tachometer, down here you've got fuel temp, you've got your oil temp, and you've got a clock. What more could you possibly want? If you wanted to tour in this car, you could definitely do it. The main thing stopping you really will be the pretty poor range. The engine really does need to be revved to get the best out of it. Now, 355s are very popular for quite some time as a Ferrari experience day car, and I can tell you pretty honestly, if you got in one of these and it was your first go in a supercar, your first go in a Ferrari, and you never did more than about 4,000 RPM, and you were on a track and you had the roof on, I think you could quite reasonably come away very, very disappointed. But on the right road, with the right conditions, and being able to drive the car as Enzo intended, it's a really, really superb automobile. You very, very quickly forget about the fact that the driving position is silly and that the dials do look a little bit old. The seats are incredibly comfortable, but also very supportive. I would say they probably strike the balance much better than the Evora. They have adjustable bolsters, they're manually adjustable, of course. The car has electric power windows. At the time, Ferrari didn't really have an extensive options list, certainly in nowhere near the way that they do now. But you could have spec'd carbon back seats if you like. People generally didn't. They generally had these seats, and that was a good choice. This particular car is a GTS, which means it has a Targa top. It's not a Spider. The roof comes off. The reason being that the owner of this particular car likes the look of a coupe, but likes the roof to come off, and as Ferrari didn't offer a sunroof on this, and they also never later offered a GTS model, they turned into Spiders. It's just had a service completed. It hadn't covered many miles recently. It had been in storage, so it had its first service in about 3 years, which is a major service. On these, the major service, the engine does officially have to come out to change the cam belts. Not all dealers will do that. Some will do it by going through the petrol tank, which is fine if you know what you're doing. It's not the official way, but it can be done. However, even if nothing is wrong with these cars, if you're using them, I would recommend that you budget at least £1,000 a year on maintenance. They are not cheap cars to run. Fuel cost is obviously going to be high, but to be honest, it will be high in pretty much most supercars. The tyre cost is actually pretty minimal because by today's standards they're pretty small tyres, but it is the servicing which will get you. If they do want to go wrong, parts are not going to be cheap. It's a Ferrari, it's Italian. You may also have to wait some time to get them in certain instances. The only other Ferrari that I've ever spent any time in is a 360. Compared to that, I would say the 355 feels much more delicate. You can feel the way that the 360 advanced the art, but given the fact that now neither of them is a particularly fast car by modern standards, certainly not modern Ferrari standards, I would always choose the 355 over the two. That being said, 360s are worth slightly less, so if you must have a right-hand drive example, you're going to be able to get a bit more for your money by going with a 360. Overall, this is a really, really super pleasant car to drive. I have driven it a few times. Every time you drive it, it feels special. It gets a lot of attention wherever it goes. Being bright yellow is certainly going to help. And if you get a good day, it's going to be great. Now, if you are out in it and it's raining, or it's snowing, or it's cold, you aren't going to have a lot of fun because there is absolutely no traction control in this car whatsoever. All you have is the fleshy bit between your thigh and the pedal. Speaking of the pedals, they are very close together. Do not drive one of these with your work boots on. You will have a bad time. So, hopefully you can kind of see a little bit about the car. Now, there is one absolutely valid reason to have a 355 over the Lotus. It's this. Now, because this is the 355, and because this is not the modern 600 horsepower 488, I can do that, and I can show it to all of you, because I was still in the national speed limit doing that, which is quite nice. I've been in a few cars, a broad officer, where you give it second and third, and you rev round, and you are way into triple figures. You would definitely wave goodbye to your license in the UK. But I'm a sensible driver, and I definitely wouldn't do those kind of speeds over here. Oh no. But if you want to have a car to enjoy, and like the Lotus, if you want to have a car that's also very enjoyable to drive at moderate speeds, when you're not completely giving it the beans, the Ferrari will definitely tick those boxes. It's certainly not perfect, there's a few things wrong with it. The pedals are a little bit stiff, the accelerator in particular is very stiff on the initial bite, so getting a smooth power transition can be a bit tricky. Some of the switchgear in here has started to go a bit tacky. That's a fairly well documented 355 issue, and I believe there are solutions to it, but the owner of this particular car hasn't gone around to it just yet, and frankly doesn't need to for a little while. The car, as mentioned, is actually quite advanced for its time, and it does have adjustable dampers. I don't really ever drive the car in sport because in comfort mode it's very well set up. Again, like the Lotus, it's actually very well damped, it's very well judged, so it's a sporty ride, but it's not overly harsh. Also of note, the 355 was the first production car to ever have an exhaust valve fitted. So when you really give it some, at about 4,000 RPM, the valve changes, comes open, and you get a very, very different tone of sound. It really changes the character of the whole car. It's not a VTEC type hit, but you can certainly appreciate the extra sonic impact. I do believe that this is possibly the best sounding car ever made. Whether you think it's better than the Evora or not is up to you. I'd say the Evora definitely gives you more sonic fireworks. Certainly it's a lower speed. The Evora also sounds a bit more agricultural at lower speed. On a noise front, the Evora wins it by a country mile. Apparently the car is something like 108 decibels at a static test at a track. I haven't been able to test mine yet, but I can definitely believe that. I've seen a few videos of the Evora online, and although you can sort of tell the type of sound that you get from it, the one thing they all fail to communicate is the sheer volume from the thing. So, that's the 355. So let's see how the Evora stacks up when driving it back to back, which really is the best way to be able to judge So, getting the Lotus now straight after the Ferrari. Immediately, this car feels much newer. That shouldn't really be a surprise. The Ferrari is celebrating its 21st birthday this year, and the Lotus is celebrating its 1 week birthday. So that's not entirely shocking. But the feel of the interior is very, very different. The Lotus certainly feels very solidly put together. Everything feels very reassuring. Now, will it stand the test of time? Honestly, I couldn't say. And not very many people with an Evora 400 can, because they're all less than a year old. However, the interiors in the original Evoras seem to wear pretty well. Lotus's interior standards have been going up and up and up at an astronomical rate recently, particularly since their purchase by DRB Highcom, and the current CEO, Jean-Marc Gales, is really making sure that the cars are being pretty well screwed together. The car feels quite a bit darker than the Ferrari, even with the hardtop on. The Ferrari, it's a much lighter and airier place to be. There's just a lot more glass in it. A large part of this is going to have to do with the design of the Evora, it being a 2+2. The designers have got less glass, more bodywork to basically hide the unusual shape. Plus the fact it's a modern car, so it's got to meet all of the modern safety and crash standards, so you're going to have things like much thicker A-pillars, B-pillars and so on. The Lotus, I would say the steering weight, it's pretty similar to the Ferrari. It's maybe a shade heavier. I much prefer the wheel. The Lotus's wheel has the cruise control functions on it, but other than that, and the airbag, which the Ferrari also doesn't have, it's fairly Spartan. But it's a superb helm. It's magnesium wheel for lightness. The wheel is also trimmed in a nice thin leather. A lot of manufacturers, particularly BMW, seem to be going for a sort of big squishy wheel, which really isn't very helpful when it's your main point of contact between you and the road, and putting it basically a big sponge in between the two of you, I don't think is a good idea. The instruments in the Lotus are fewer than in the Ferrari. There is no oil or water, temperature or pressure gauges. Personally, I would have liked a few more gauges. I know there's a reason that they sort of ditch them. You know, they take up space, people tend to ignore them anyway, and sometimes they just outright lie, but I would have appreciated just a little bit more. It would help make the car, in my opinion, feel that a little bit more like the supercar that Lotus kind of say it is. Now, the driving experience between the two, the handling is kind of similar. I would say the Lotus gives me an awful lot more confidence. That may just be the fact that I own the Lotus and I don't own the Ferrari. I would say that I know it much better, and I also know that the Lotus has a very advanced traction control system, whereas the Ferrari has a, oh, sorry about that, should you get it wrong. So, I don't know. In any case, what isn't debatable is the amount of shove that the Lotus has from low down. The Ferrari really needs to be above about 4,000, preferably 5,000 RPM before it starts getting a wriggle on. The Lotus has got shove from about 2,000 onwards, and from 3,000 it really can push you back into your seat. There's more torque than the Ferrari, it's very evenly spread, and to be honest, the Lotus is probably actually holding its torque back for the benefit of the gearbox. On the subject of the gearbox, Lotus in the past have had a lot of stick for their poor gearboxes. In fact, the last time a Lotus went up against the 355 in any sort of serious contemporary comparison, it was with the old Esprit. Firstly the S4 and later the V8. The Esprit V8 was using a gearbox that was donated from the Renault 25. Lotus were using it some considerable time after Renault had stopped. There were reasons that they used it. Basically, it was the only gearbox that fit in the space that they had, but the problem was it was a very fragile, not particularly pleasant by all accounts gearbox. This thing is an absolute revelation. I would say the gearbox has gone straight past being functional, and it's straight into the category of being a real pleasure to use. It's very mechanical, but it's very smooth. You get this sort of rifle bolt action as you go through the gears. It's a very short throw compared to the Ferrari, and it's just a joy to row your own gears. The gearbox is a classic Lotus weak point, and in this car it's actually a highlight. So that's kind of unexpected, particularly when the Ferrari gated shifter is something that's now borderline idolized by fans of the marque, and something that people kind of lament now that it's gone. So the two cars do share a few design traits which would explain them perhaps handling in a similar fashion. Both cars use a double wishbone suspension setup at the front and the rear, which is fairly unusual because it's a relatively heavy and expensive suspension setup. The plus side is that when you're engineering the suspension, you can control the wheel and its contact with the road very precisely. I recently read a biography of Colin Chapman, and he was an early innovator in suspension geometry and setup, and he was one of the first people to start taking serious temperature readings of his tyres, because he realised even then that if you can't transmit all the power that you have to the road, then having more power is not going to help you go any faster. And this car is a pretty prime example of that. 400 horsepower when the 355 came out was a huge number, and people wrote about the 355 outperforming the F40 in certain tests, notably handling ones. But nowadays 400 horsepower is achievable by pretty much anybody with a turbo hot hatch and a tuning chip. But the Lotus makes sure that all of that power is very usable by channeling through the rear wheels as they should be instead of the fronts or all four wheels. It makes sure that the steering is uncorrupted and that you can get the power down pretty effectively. The tyres on this are 285s at the rear, so it's a very well planted car. Notably, the weight distribution of these two cars is identical as well. It's basically 61% to the rear, 39% to the front, so they're both quite light at the front. I don't know the precise weight of the Ferrari. The quoted weight for a 355 is 1,350 kilograms, but that is a weight for the GTB, and that is a dry weight. The GTS model and the Spider are both going to have extra chassis bracing in them, which is going to contribute some weight, and the fluids that are required to obviously make the car go are going to weigh a fair bit as well. I would guess that in total the 355 I've driven today is probably about 100 kilos heavier than this car. That's not bad when you consider that the 355 is a steel-bodied car, and it's in some ways quite old. The 355 is a real bridge between the old and the new for Ferrari. Now, the Evora is built on a technology that Lotus have been using for some 20 odd years now, so that may seem old, but you have to remember that a lot of manufacturers still haven't caught up with what is a pretty innovative technology. Ace Car magazine recently had an Evora 400 on a test where they were having an Aston Martin GT12, and they made a point of mentioning that that car, despite having a sort of 200 horsepower advantage, was actually not as fast across country as the Evora 400, and I can believe that completely. I've driven this car on roads that I know very, very well, and I've driven in a large variety of cars, and very, very few, if any, cars have been so composed over lumps and bumps. It's very important, obviously, to keep the wheels in contact with the road for grip, but also for driver comfort. There's a few cars I've been in, notably a few hot hatchbacks, where the suspension setup is so stiff in order to get a sporty ride that basically the driver is probably going to back off before the car will. Plus, if you go over certain bumps or crests in the road, if you've got a very stiff suspension, then your wheels are going to lift off the road, and obviously if the wheel is off the road, it's not contributing to your grip at all. This car's obviously got a few more modern creature comforts like heated seats, xenon headlights, that sort of stuff, but it's a very, very livable and usable car. Anyone that's thinking about buying one of these for daily use, yep, can easily live with it. If you could live with a 911 or an R8, there is literally no reason you could not live with one of these. The 911 is a car that I'm going to talk about more in another video, but it's something that is often compared with the Evora, particularly its new 400 guys. However, the reality is, having driven this car about for a week now, that the sense of occasion, the noise, and the general public reception of the car really does put it in a league with things like Ferraris, McLarens and Lamborghinis. If you want a car that's going to gather a crowd, this will do it. Pretty much no Porsche will do that. One thing that has happened as a result of this being a more modern car is, despite the fact that it is only about 2 inches narrower than the Ferrari, is that it feels considerably more intimate in here. A fact that is probably much more apparent to my cameraman Laurie than it is to me. I can certainly feel that all the controls are sort of much closer to me, much more immediate, and I don't really have as much space to maneuver in here. I don't quite know how that has happened. I do know in the 355 that the seats are actually fitted asymmetrically. You don't particularly notice it, but if you look, you'll notice that the driver's seat is actually fitted closer to the centre of the car than the passenger seat. It's one of these little odd details and quirks that I love to sort of have a bit of car trivia on standby. So there we have it. 2 great cars from 2 great manufacturers. One already an icon, and the other I believe will go down firmly as one of the marque's best models. But the question remains, if you had the money, which should you choose? Well, that's up to you, and you're not going to go wrong with either. Personally, I went with the Evora 400. Am I happy with my choice after today? Absolutely. So while we're out filming the Ferrari, the Lotus appears to have gained a friend. Look at that! Wouldn't that make a nice driveway? There's a Jaguar just pulled out in front of me. I don't know why, but